That's Job 14, 1 through 14. Man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. Like a flower, he comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. You also open your eyes on him and bring him into judgment with yourself. Who can make the clean out of the unclean? No one. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you, and his limits you have set so that he cannot pass. Turn your gaze from him, that he may rest until he fulfills his day like a hired man. For there is hope for a tree when it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and its shoots will not fail. Though its roots grow old in the ground, and its stump dies in the dry soil. At the scent of water it will flourish and put forth sprigs like a plant. But man dies and lies prostrate. Man expires, and where is he? As water evaporates from the sea, and a river becomes parched and dried up, so man lies down and does not rise until the heavens are no longer. He will not awake nor be aroused out of his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath returns to you, that you would set a limit for me and remember me. If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes.
It was about this time of the year 7 years ago I received a call. Yes. No, let's wait. Let me tell this story and then we'll pass you out some outlines. About this time of the year, received a call from a man who identified himself as an elder in one of the Nashville churches. And he said, I've heard of the work you do. Let me tell you what's going on. Our preacher, who has been with us 23 years, is resigning October 1st. Now that's confidential, he said, but he's going to be announcing he's retiring. He has agreed to stay with us until the 1st of January, and our aim is to have a new preacher in place by then. What we would like for you to do is come and hold a workshop to help us, our search committee and elders, to do a good search. Would you be able to do that? I said, yeah, I would be glad to do that. And I said, in fact, that'll work out real well for me. If your preacher resigns October 1st, and you all get to work and get you a new preacher by the 1st of January, and he preaches up to that time, that'll be just about right when I finish the next interim for me to work with you all, because you'll be needing a new preacher in 18 months. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, that's the general rule. Maybe an exception, but most of the time. He said, well, what do you think we ought to be doing during that 3 months? I said, glad you asked. Let me tell you a parable. Let's assume that your wife has not been feeling well. You go to the doctor. The doctor does a number of tests. He calls you and her into his office and said, I regret to tell you the results. You have stage 4 cancer all through your body. My estimate is you have about 3 months to live. What are you going to do during those 3 months? He said, well, take care of my wife. I said, good. That's what you need to be doing. Let me ask you another question. Do you think you would be scripturally authorized to marry again after your wife dies? He said, well, sure. I said, okay. See how this would work out. You'll be taking care of your wife. And one of the things you may want to do is maybe every Friday night or every other Friday night say, honey, I'm going to be gone for 3 or 4 hours. I've got a good-looking widow lady I'm going to be taking out. We're going to have dinner and go to a movie, and I'll be back about 10 o'clock. And you could have somebody picked out. Probably wouldn't want to get married that afternoon of the funeral, but the next morning y'all could get married and you only had to spend one night alone. He said, well, what do you think we ought to be doing this church? I said, all right, here's my recommendation. Your preacher has been with you 23 years. That is a compliment to you and to him. You don't get along that many years without doing some good work. And so what I recommend for you to do and for your preacher to do is spend 3 months reminiscing, expressing gratitude for the good relationship you've had for the next 23 years. That'll be best for you, for your present preacher, and for your next preacher. The idea that we can exchange people that are important to us like we do automobile parts is part of what gets us in a bind. If the alternator goes out on my car, I want to be able to go to Ed Bryan at Accurate Automotive in Smyrna, Tennessee, and say, Ed, I need a new alternator. And he'll take the old one out and he'll stick a new one in and it's fixed. People aren't like that. And so what we're looking at tonight is how to have a good funeral. It may be the death of a spouse, it may be a divorce, it may be retirement, it may be moving, any number of things that interrupts our life as it is. In Mark 4, verses 43 to 44, Mark makes this observation after Jesus has told some parables. He said, and with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it, but without a parable he did not speak to them. And when they were alone, he explained all things to his disciples. The way Jesus taught was through stories. Okay, fellas, you all can be passing these out now. Thank you. Jesus taught through stories. And he said, here, let me tell you how this is. And he'd tell a story. And so we're using this how to have a funeral as a parable. How to end relationships with people and sometimes with things. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2:2, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He said, all I ever emphasized over and over and over again was Jesus Christ and him crucified. I used to think that was an overstatement, but the more I think about it and observe the writings of Paul, the more I realize that process was what he talked about over and over again. If he were telling people how to be saved, and what they did as they became Christians, it was Jesus Christ and him crucified. Romans 6, 1 through 7. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died has been freed from sin. And so conversion, what is it? Jesus Christ and him crucified, death, burial, and resurrection. If we're talking about Christian growth, what is it? Jesus Christ and him crucified. Ephesians chapter 4. He talks about we should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But you have not so learned Christ, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you should put off concerning your former conduct, the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man which was created to God according to God in true righteousness and holiness. Notice, death, burial, and resurrection, illustration after illustration. Therefore, putting away lying, let each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we're members of one another. Be angry, do not sin, do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ has forgiven you. We need to have funerals for sinful attitudes and actions. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. If you then were raised with Christ, see here's Jesus Christ, him crucified, death, burial, resurrection. If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth, for you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appeared, then you also will appear with him in glory. Therefore put to death, there's your death, put to death your members which are on earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. Over and over again we see that die, burial, resurrection. Paul said that's all I ever talked about, all I ever wanted to discuss. Jesus prepared his disciples for his death. I'm amazed at the way he did that, but he very conscientiously started from Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16, verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, for you are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. Then Jesus said to his disciples, If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Jesus said this is the way it's going to be. Not only am I going to die, but it may be possible, and in fact, looking back from this side, it was probable. According to history, only one apostle died a natural death, and that was John. And so Jesus, he told them, they resisted, they fussed, they denied it, they got confused, and he just kept saying it over and over and over again. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 2. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men. The living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely, oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and the bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you did not inquire wisely concerning this. It may be that many people who spend most of their time living the past haven't had enough good funerals. They just can't bury the past so they can enjoy the future. Burying the past does not mean that we deny the good times and good experiences we had with people and places and events in the past. It simply said that's past, this is now, and the former days weren't better than this. Being read from Job 14, 1 to 14. Many people think that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. May even predate the Pentateuch in its writing. You know what people wondered hundreds, thousands of years ago? If a man die, will he live again? There's hope for a tree that it goes down in the fall, but then it buds out again in the spring. And if a tree can do that, I wonder if a person can do that he's dead and is buried, and then maybe there's a rebudding, there's a resurrection. Jesus continued to deal with his disciples. They were sad, they were confused. And some of the last words he said to them, John 14, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So you may be thinking of the death of a loved one, but it may be many other things. We need to have funerals for things that are gone. This outline and this concept, the first time that I was able to use it in this thorough way, we'd had the fuss at 95 of Bears Chapel. All the elders resigned. We appointed new elders November 19, 1995, 4 men who had never served before. 2 years went by, and one of the elders had a stepfather who had very serious health issues. He came and resigned. He said, I can't take care of him and do the duties of the elder that I need to. He resigned. The next year, they wanted to appoint new leadership. They decided to do that, and I asked them, I think it was in February at our meeting, are y'all going to have a funeral for the eldership? They said, what are you talking about? I said, I just wonder if you wanted to have a funeral for this eldership. Let me make 2 observations. When a congregation appoints new elders, I've observed 2 things. Number one, generally, you don't get a new elder. You get a new junior elder, a new trainee. Number 2, when you add a new elder, you not only get a new elder, 2 new elders, you get a new eldership. If you have a beaker with an element in it, and you add the drop of another element, you don't have just some more stuff. You have a new compound. You have an entirely different situation. And I thought it might be good just to formalize that and have a funeral for this eldership so we could do a death, burial, and resurrection. Well, I was always making suggestions, wasn't offended when they didn't take everything I suggested. But when we came back to March's meeting, they said, we talked about it, we want to have a funeral, and we want you to preach it. And so what you have essentially is the outline that we used. We went down to Bell Buckle, Tennessee, where they have the R.C. Cola and Moon Pie Festival every year. One of the elders had a log cabin down there, and we spent the night, and we had a 3-hour funeral for that eldership. recognizing that this eldership was going to die, a new elder was going to be added, and there would be a new eldership. And so here's some of the things we talked about. What are you losing? What are you going to lose? These men lost a relationship that would never be again in the history of the world. I guess it's the only time, it was the only time I've ever been involved in working with a brand new eldership, and especially one that had never, not one of them had ever served before, but they did a marvelous job. They announced to the congregation, we only have 2 objectives this first year. Number 1, we're going to read everything in the Bible that is said about elders, shepherds, bishops, overseers, Old Testament, New Testament. There's a lot, especially in Ezekiel, about shepherds. And we're going to try to practice being that kind of leaders. That's objective number 1. We'll spend a year doing that, studying the Bible, trying to put into practice what we learn. Number 2, we're going to spend sufficient time and effort to learn how to get along with each other. I'm reading a book called Church Reset. It's powerful. This brother suggests that what many congregations have done is modeled themselves after the business model and not after what we read about in the New Testament. And so we use business principles to take care of spiritual things. And he said that's not healthy. The business model says somebody resigns, all you got to do is get on ZipRecruiter, look it up. Mike Rowe said that a lot of people can get them a new person 24 hours. Man, that's pretty good, isn't it? Incidentally, evidently it works. My daughter was considering a new job, and she was languishing and how to go about it, and I thought, well, I've heard Mike Rowe talk about ZipRecruiter. I got on ZipRecruiter and put her desire in and location, and sure enough, she made a call or 2, going to work for a new company, new preschool, the first day of August. That's the way we do in business. And a lot of times we think we can just do that, and sometimes we think that we can do that in relationships. But we need to think about, no, what is it we're losing? What is it we're losing? And what they were going to be losing, and unless they were going to try to keep it just like it always had been, they were going to have to learn how to incorporate a new person. I remember premarital counseling I had a number of years ago. That was an interesting situation. She was the daughter of one of her deacons. I developed a lot of premarital counseling while I was in Dalton, Georgia. Up until that time, I didn't know much to say. But I started developing some concepts and prepared several sessions of premarital counseling. And I told the elders, I don't know anywhere in the Bible that says a preacher has to do a wedding ceremony. And so my choice is I will not do a wedding ceremony unless I participate in premarital counseling. They say, we think that's an excellent idea. So we had that set and started doing that. Well, the parents of this young lady came and said, you know, she's getting married and we want you to do her marriage. I said, fine, we just need to set up some premarital counseling. We can't do that. What do you mean you can't do it? Well, her husband-to-be is in the Navy, and he's not going to have time. He'll just be in a few days before the wedding, and they'll have to spend all that time getting ready for their wedding. I said, well, it seems to me like it might be a good idea if they'd spend 3 or 4 hours of that time getting ready for their marriage. And so we'll be doing some premarital counseling. They say I haven't got time. And it's going to be embarrassing. We have to tell our family and friends that our preacher won't perform the wedding ceremony. I said, I'm willing. Don't tell them I'm unwilling. I'm willing. I don't have a lot going on between midnight and 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, so whenever we can arrange the time. Well, sure enough, we did, and they cooperated well. What was happening, they were going to get married, and they were going to get on a plane and fly to the Mediterranean where he was stationed and would be there for some time. And in one of our sessions, big old tears started running down her cheek. I said, honey, what's the matter? She said, I'm just afraid that once I get married, things will never be the same anymore. I said, you are exactly right. They'll never be the same anymore. And she didn't get married. Probably a good idea. She wasn't ready for the funeral. So what are you losing? What are you losing? Part of the premarital counseling process is, with the couple, we talk about the funeral. How are you grieving the loss of being single? What are you losing? What's going to be different? And then when we do in-law stew, we talk with the parents. How are you grieving the loss of your child? Most frequent response is this. Oh, we're not losing a son, we're gaining a daughter. I said, you will be losing a son and gaining a daughter. Your relationship will never be the same after the wedding. That doesn't mean it'll be bad. It may be even better, but it'll never be the same. You need to learn what you're losing and grieve that so you can establish a new relationship. If you're constantly trying to keep it the same, it'll be in a bigger mess than it's ever been. You're losing something, you're gaining something. Paul said, all I determined to know among you was Jesus Christ and him crucified. There was a death, there was a burial, and there was a resurrection. And what happens, a lot of us want to skip the death and then get the resurrection. Doesn't work that way. Crucifixion, burial, resurrection. What will you miss? What are some of the things you're going to miss about whatever the relationship is going to be? What good things do you have to say about this person or thing that you're losing? And we spent some time. I said a number of good things. Again, I've never experienced that before, but it was a positive experience to see these four men. Each of them had thought and planned and prepared to be an elder, but they said, we didn't want to at this time. We'd like for it to be a few more years. But the congregation says, we've just been through a fuss. We don't have an eldership. We need some people to lead. Would you all please do that? They were chosen by the congregation, just like we read in Acts chapter 6. The elders couldn't appoint them because they didn't have any elders, so the congregation selected them. And so they said, okay, here we are. How are we going to get together? How are we going to deal with this? And it was beautiful. They did a great job doing that. And so they talked about that. How are you going to deal with your loss? See, one of the things that people resist is going through this process because it's complicated. You have to think. This is called, we talked this morning, one of the reasons that Jesus was able to meld a good relationship among different kind of men is that they processed their emotions. They dealt with being mad, sad, glad, and scared, and they worked with all of that. And once you say, okay, I'm scared, but I need to do it, and so I'm not going to say, well, I'm scared, I can't do it. I'm going to say, I'm scared and I need to do it. And so with my fear, I'm going to march on and do the difficult thing that needs to be done. I'm sad, but because I'm sad, I'm not going to fail to work through that and get to a new position. So we talked all about that. How did you come into this relationship? We talked about the fuss that we'd just been through and the part that each one of them played in it and how we worked through all of that. What fears did you have when you started this relationship? What fears did you have when you got married? I had some concern about how I was going to support Gail and go to school and pay rent and utilities and buy groceries on $65 a week. Evidently, I didn't think about it a whole lot because I went ahead and got married anyhow. God provided for our ignorance and provided a job that paid $75 a week 2 days before we got married. Whew, boy, I just missed that one. But those were some concerns that we had. What fears did you have when you started, when you got married? Anybody else ever scared when you started a new job? I remember my first job. I was 11 years old. It was the third time I'd been around the square in Centerville, Tennessee. And I would go around to every store, do y'all need any help? I'd like to have a job. 9, 10, 11 years old. 9 and 10, everybody turned me down. 11 years old, I called on my last place, Barber store. And they turned me down, and I was going home, 3rd year in a row, defeated. And she came out, I can still see her, came out, and it was kind of went downhill. And I was walking to go back home. She said, "Little Jerry," that was my official title there. "Little Jerry, do you really want to work?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." She said, "Be here in the morning at 7 o'clock. I went home and told Mother and Daddy I got a job at Barber store. First job they gave me, remember the old days when they paid you a nickel for every Coke bottle you brought in? They recycled all of those. That was my job, was to stack hundreds of Coke bottles out beside the store. And there were some small and some large, and I didn't know what in the world I was doing. I didn't know how to get them all balanced and keep them from falling over. And the looks I got, I can still see a high school football player. He was sweeping. They used to throw down floor sweep on a tile floor, and then they'd brush all that up, and that's the way they swept the floor. And they gave me one of these grocery boy aprons. And mine drugged the floor about that much. Mother finally made me some custom-made aprons that didn't have to be taken up. And I remember that fellow looked up at me like, "What in the world are you doing here?" I remember one of the first bags of groceries I ever packed. I like to be neat, and so it seemed to me like that package of rolls would go just right down in the bottom of that. And so I put it down, and then I started piling on those cans of beans and other things, and they said, "Little Jerry, you need to put the bread on top and the hard stuff on the bottom." Okay. That was the first job. But pretty well every job, maybe through West Nashville Heights, when I went from one congregation to another, I said, "What in the world am I doing? What have I gotten myself into? This is too big for me to handle." And so that fear is normal. What fears did you have? How long did it take for you to grow up to feel like real elders, parents, homeowners, or a married person? I look to the summer when I was 37 years old as a time when I finally grew up to where some of the time I felt like an adult. It was about that time that I learned to talk to elders as adult to adult instead of daddy to his little boy. Now that was just part of the time. It took a few years later to feel like that most of the time. But that was the summer that I remember starting to grow up. Still feel like a child sometimes, but not as much as I used to. 78 and pretty well feeling grown up by now. What do you need to do to say goodbye to this relationship? What do you need to do to kind of finish it up and remember what you need to remember, do what you need to do? Do you need to get pictures? What do you need to do? One of the hard decisions in leaving Dalton, Georgia, I thought it was time to leave, and one of the things that kept holding me back was our house. First house we'd ever owned. Daddy built it for us. And we liked it. It was in a beautiful place. It was exactly what we wanted. I hated to leave what Daddy had built. He did me a favor. He said, "Jerry, I know you're concerned about that, but that's a house. You're a preacher. And if you need to sell that house and go somewhere else, don't let that hold you back. You need to do what you need to do." And so what we decided to do to have a funeral is I borrowed somebody's down in the swing, and I swung back and forth with that in my hand. And then I got in a rocking chair, and I rocked back and forth, and I took a picture of Rocky Face Mountain on the front, the creek down there. We went down to the back of the property and we went through every room of the house, taking pictures. Here's Jerry Wayne's room and Christy's room and all the others. When I got through, I said, "Anything else?" And Christy said, "Daddy, have you taken a picture of my rock?" I said, I didn't know you had a rock. She said, yeah, there's one rock out there. It was a completely rock house. We picked all the rocks up at Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, out of the river. There's one rock, she said, if you hit it with a 2-liter Coke bottle, it sounds different from every other rock in the back. So we took a picture of Christie's rock. Took a picture of Jerrie Wayne's tree that he mowed down, had to pay $1 for it. Came back and he mowed it down again the next year, and I tried to charge him for it. He said, no, I bought it last year. That's mine. So that was Jerrie Wayne's tree. Came back the next year. And so we did that to have memories and yet to grieve of what we were losing. One of the finest jobs I ever saw was Chad and Shelley Hedgepath. She was Shelley Stem at the time. Chad was our youth minister, and they were getting married. And we were doing premarital counseling months before their marriage. And here's what they decided to do for their last Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays at home. On that Thanksgiving, the year before they got married, Shelley went to her family and Chad went to his family, and they went individually. And they had this discussion: this is the last Thanksgiving we'll ever have before I get married. Next year it's going to be different. Christmas, same thing. This is the last Christmas we'll have. Last Christmas I'll have as a single person. Don't know what we're going to be doing next year. We'll be a family and we'll have to decide how we're going to do that. Isn't that a nice way to recognize death, burial, and resurrection? A lot of people live a lifetime doing what mom and daddy want them to do when really they feel stressed out and rather be somewhere else. Nothing wrong with doing that, but there's nothing wrong with saying we're going to establish our own memories and habits as a new family, and that's what they decided to do. What unfinished business do you have? See, if you got unfinished business, you need to finish up your business before you get into the new relationship. I don't know if you've ever read the story of Maury Schwartz and Mitch Albom. They had been at, I think one was the teacher of the other, and they promised to keep in touch. So Mitch saw Maury on Nightline, Ted Koppel, and told about his ALS disease. And he said he wanted to teach one more lesson, and that was how to die. Mitch remembered his promise to keep in touch. And it had been years since he made that promise. It was a teacher that had a lot of influence on his life, and so he called him up. And he said, I'd like for us to renew that relationship. And so each week, he flew 2,700 miles each week for 14 Tuesdays and wrote a book called Tuesdays with Maury. 16 million copies in 45 languages have been sold. And they renewed their relationship and had a tremendous effect on a lot of people. One of the things they did was to have his funeral while he was still alive. That was a neat idea. I had an experience like that. Uncle Ewell and Aunt Sue Jones kept our kids when we went to the Holy Land in 1973. Uncle Ewell got cancer. And while he had cancer and was in the hospital in Murray County Hospital in Tennessee, Columbia, Tennessee, they had a celebration of their 50th wedding anniversary, and they asked me to speak and some other people. And so they brought him down out of his room and set him down there, and we got up and told what we appreciated about that family. They took him back to his room, and each individual family got to go in and talk with Uncle Ewell for a few minutes. I thought, isn't this neat? 169 hours from that afternoon, we would gather together at Oaks and Nichols Funeral Home for his funeral. And all we did is just said what was said last week. We got to say it to him alive, and then we got to say it to others after he died. And so that's a neat way to work through it. And might not be a good idea. You don't have to tell a person you're preaching their funeral, but certainly we can express appreciation and admonition and gratitude for people while they're still alive. Number 10, how will you deal with your jealousy or others' jealousy if you become aware of it? Your jealousy of others who have not suffered your loss, or others' jealousy of you who feel that you have not lost as much as they have. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? One of the things we explored, I said, now, let's think about this. You're bringing a new man on. Bears Chapel, for a decade, has had a fuss every 2 years. Fuss of 86, fuss of 88, fuss of 90, fuss of 92, and then they skipped a year, let me get on board, and we had the fuss of 95 after I got there. Now, it's been about 3 years since we've had a fuss. If we have another one, you know what's going to happen? They're going to say, well, it must be the new elder's fault. Everything's fine until he got here. However, on the other side, this new elder's been a preacher. He's been a missionary in Africa. Are you going to be intimidated and jealous of him and his experience? How are you going to work with all that? See, all that stuff's going on. Most of the time, unconscious, unspoken, understood. That's one way to do it. One of the ways to get ready is to have it conscious, spoken, and understood. Number 11, how do you feel about starting over in a new relationship or without a relationship? How are you going to work out your rules? How are you going to build a good relationship? Or what some people do when they have a loss, they say, we're not going to do that anymore. I remember Barber, incidentally, who died this past week. She was my secretary in Madisonville, Kentucky, the last one I had before I moved. They lived out in a subdivision north of town. They were evangelistic people. They liked to talk to people, and a new person moved into the neighborhood, and she'd wave, and she said the lady would just always turn around. And finally, one day she went down and got to talking with this lady and said, I'd like to talk with you, like to invite you to service. The lady said, nope, I don't want any friends. Every time I've moved, it hurts so bad that I've decided this time I'm not going to make any more friends so I can keep myself from getting hurt again. That's one of the choices. Not too good. Live a lonely life that way, but that's one of the choices in what some people decide to do. What hope do you have and what dreams do you have? Is there really life after death? If a man dies, shall he live again? If a relationship dies, is there hope for a productive and enjoyable life after that, after a divorce or after a death? If a man dies, shall he live again? Is there any hope? This came out in Christianity Today, October 3, 1994. As Vice President George Bush represented the United States at the funeral of former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, he was deeply moved by a silent protest carried out by Brezhnev's widow. She stood motionless by the coffin until seconds before it was closed. Then, just as the soldiers touched the lid, Brezhnev's wife performed an act of great courage and hope. She reached down and made the sign of the cross on her husband's chest. There in the center of secular, atheistic power, the wife of the man who had run it all hoped that her husband was wrong. She hoped there was another life and that life was best represented by Jesus, who died on the cross, and that the same Jesus might yet have mercy on her husband. I don't care how big we are, how small we are, there's that question, there's that hope that Job expressed, if a man die, shall he live again? So how are we going to communicate our hopes and dreams to ourselves and to others who are important to us? I've mentioned these several times. 5 tasks of dying. Anytime we leave a relationship, here's a good way to do it. Number 1, forgive me. Number 2, I forgive you. Number 3, I love you. Number 4, thank you. Number 5, goodbye. 2 Samuel 12:15-23, David had had that relationship with Bathsheba. She was pregnant, the child was born, the child was sick, and for 7 days David fasted and prayed, and then the child died. His companions were afraid to tell him, look how he's grieved, what you going to do after you find out his child's died? And when they told him, he got up, washed himself, ate, went to worship. They said, we don't understand. When the child was sick, you grieved. And now that he's dead, you get up. He said, well, I cannot go to him, but he can come to me. David had processed his grief, and he was ready now to get up and go about his further life. He said, I've done all I can do, and now it's time to go to the next step. He had hope after the funeral. 2 books, I mentioned these before. Good Grief by Granger Westberg and Tear Soup. 2 good books for people in grief. So, question, do you need to have a funeral? And the funeral we're talking about here, do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him by baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. If you need to do that, tonight would be a good time to have a funeral, death, burial, and resurrection for new hope and new life. Come as we sing.